The pen stopped moving in Dmitry Kasarov's hand the moment he saw it. A dark mark circled Alina Voss's wrist, peeking out from under her sleeve as she reached to dust the top shelf of his study. She pulled her arm back fast, but it was too late. He had already seen it, and men like Dmitry never forgot what they saw. Alina had worked in his house for 6 months. She moved through the halls quietly, careful never to draw attention, careful never to let anyone look at her too closely. She kept her sleeves long even in the warm months. She flinched at loud sounds. She always seemed to be listening for footsteps behind her. Until this morning, no one in the house had noticed. Now, the most powerful man in the city could not stop noticing. He said nothing right away. Instead, he watched her finish her work, tracking the way she avoided using her left arm, the way she kept her body turned slightly away from him whenever she passed. When she left the study, he sat back in his chair and stared at the closed door for a long moment. That evening, Dmitry called his head of security into the study. He did not raise his voice, but there was an edge in it that made the other man stand a little straighter. He asked for everything there was to know about Alina Voss, where she lived, who she spoke to, who came to her apartment when she was not at work. The security chief nodded once and left without asking why. Dmitry was not a man who involved himself in the personal lives of his staff. He paid well, expected loyalty, and rarely looked twice at the people who kept his house running. But something about the fear in Alina's eyes that morning had cut through his usual distance. It reminded him of something he did not like to think about, something from long before he became the man everyone in the city feared. 2 hours later, a folder appeared on his desk. He opened it slowly, reading each page with growing tension in his jaw. There were notes about a man named Marco, listed as Alina's husband, though the marriage had ended in every way except on paper. There were mentions of visits to her apartment on the days she was not working. There were gaps in the records, silences that told their own story. Dmitry closed the folder and sat in silence for a long time. Outside his window, the city lights flickered on one by one, but he barely noticed them. His mind kept returning to the image of that mark on her wrist, and the way she had pulled her sleeve down so quickly, as if hiding it was second nature to her. He thought about how many times she must have done that before, in front of people who never looked closely enough to see it. He thought about how easy it would have been for him to miss it too, if he had glanced up from his papers just 1 second later. By the time he finally rose from his desk, something in him had already decided. He would not simply let this sit. Whatever was happening in Alina's life outside these walls, he intended to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, Alina arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, hopping to finish her work before anyone else was awake. Instead, she found Dmitry already in the study, standing by the window with his arms crossed, waiting for her. Her stomach tightened. She assumed he had noticed something wrong with her work, or worse, that he had decided to let her go. Jobs like this one were hard to find, and she needed this one more than he could ever know. She stepped inside quietly, keeping her eyes low. Dmitry turned to face her, and for a moment he simply studied her, the way he studied a business deal before deciding whether to trust it. Then he asked a single question, his voice quiet but firm. He wanted to know who had hurt her. Alina felt the air leave her lungs. She opened her mouth and gave the same answer she always gave, the one about tripping on the stairs in her apartment building, about being clumsy, about it being nothing at all. The words came out fast and rehearsed, the way lies do when they have been told too many times. Dmitry did not respond right away. He had spent years learning to read people, deciding who was telling the truth and who was hiding something behind a well-practiced smile. Alina's story did not hold up, and they both seemed to know it. He did not push her further that day. Instead, he told her something that surprised her more than any accusation could have. He said that nothing that belonged under his roof would be harmed without consequence, and that included the people who worked for him. His voice carried a weight that made the words feel less like comfort and more like a promise. Alina left the study with her heart pounding, unsure whether she felt relief or fear. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, as if her safety actually mattered to someone with real power. She had spent so long believing she was invisible in this house, just another pair of hands keeping the floors clean and the shelves dusted. Over the next few days, she noticed small changes. Dmitri seemed to appear in rooms she was cleaning more often than before. He asked simple questions about her day, nothing that felt intrusive, but enough to make her realize he was paying attention in a way he never had before. She did not know what to make of it. At night, alone in her small apartment, Alina would sit by the window and think about his words. Nothing that belonged under his roof would be harmed. She was not sure she believed anyone could protect her from the fear that followed her home each evening, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like if someone actually could. She did not yet know that Dmitri was already several steps ahead of her, piecing together a truth she had spent years trying to hide from everyone, including herself. It took less than a week for Dmitri to have every answer he needed. The folder on his desk had grown thicker, filled with details that painted a clear and troubling picture of Alina's life outside the mansion walls. Her husband, a man named Marco, had left the marriage on paper but never truly let go. He appeared at her apartment on the days she was not working, always when no one else was around to see. He took the money she earned, leaving her with barely enough to survive on. He controlled her comings and goings, and the fear Dmitri had seen in her eyes that first morning suddenly made perfect sense. Dmitri called Alina into the study again, but this time his tone was different. Softer, though still steady. He told her he knew about Marco. He did not need to say how. Alina's composure finally broke, and years of carefully guarded silence came pouring out all at once. She told him about the early years of her marriage, when things had seemed normal, even happy. She told him how slowly everything had changed. How Marco's control had crept into every part of her life until she barely recognized the person she had become. She told him she had been too afraid and too ashamed to ask anyone for help, certain that no one would believe a maid over a man who still held power over her life on paper. Dmitri listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but his attention complete. When she finished speaking, tears streaking her face, he said only 3 words, "That ends now." Alina did not know what those words meant at first. She assumed he intended to fire her, worried that her personal troubles had become too much of a burden for his household. Instead, Dmitri explained that he intended to handle the situation himself, in his own way, and that she no longer needed to fear Marco showing up at her door. She wanted to protest, to tell him this was not his problem to solve, but something in his expression stopped her. This was a man used to fixing things that seemed impossible to everyone else. For the first time since she could remember, Alina let herself imagine a life where she did not have to look over her shoulder every time she walked home. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing between hope and disbelief. She had spent so long carrying this weight alone that the idea of someone else stepping in felt almost impossible to accept. Yet there was something in the certainty of Dmitri's voice that made her want to believe him, even if she could not fully explain why. She did not know exactly what he planned to do, and some part of her feared what that might mean. But a larger part of her, the part that had been silent and afraid for far too long, felt something close to relief. Whatever happened next, she would not be facing it by herself anymore. Dmitri did not waste time. Within 2 days, he sent 2 of his most trusted men to find Marco and deliver a message that left no room for misunderstanding. There would be no more visits to Alina's apartment, no more demands for money, no more fear waiting behind her front door. The details of that conversation never reached Alina directly, and Dmitri made sure of it. He did not want her carrying the weight of knowing exactly what had been said or done on her behalf. All she needed to know was the outcome, and within a matter of days, the outcome became clear. Marco left the city entirely, boarding a flight with no plans to return, his accounts emptied of the money he had taken from her for years. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina's phone did not ring with unknown numbers. Her apartment door did not creak open uninvited. The fear that had followed her home every evening simply stopped, as though someone had finally turned off a switch she had lived beside for years without ever believing it could be reached. Dmitri arranged for a doctor to see her privately, someone he trusted to be discreet and kind. He offered her a room in a private section of the mansion, a place with better locks, better light, and no memories waiting behind the door. Alina hesitated at first, unused to accepting help so freely given, but eventually she agreed, telling herself it was simply practical, easier than commuting each day. Word moved quietly through the people who worked for Dmitri. Something had shifted in the boss, though none of them dared say it directly to him. He had never involved himself in matters this personal before, and yet here he was, making sure a member of his household staff slept without fear for the first time in years. Alina noticed the change too, though it took her time to trust it. She began sleeping through the night. She stopped flinching at every sound in the hallway. Slowly, she started to stand a little taller to meet the eyes of the people around her instead of looking away. It was a small transformation, but to her it felt enormous, like slowly stepping out of a shadow she had lived inside for years. Dmitri watched these changes from a distance, careful not to make her feel observed or pressured. He had done what needed to be done, and now it seemed the only thing left was to let her heal in her own time and her own way. He told himself that was all this had ever been about, protecting someone who worked under his roof. But some evenings, when he passed her in the hallway and she offered him a small, genuine smile, he found himself thinking about her long after she had walked away. It was a feeling he did not fully understand yet, unfamiliar and quietly persistent, like a question he had not yet decided to ask. Weeks passed, and the mansion settled into a new kind of quiet. Alina no longer flinched at sudden sounds. She no longer wore long sleeves to hide marks that were finally allowed to fade. She began to laugh occasionally with the other household staff, small sounds of happiness that had been missing from her life for far too long. Dmitri noticed every change, the way he noticed everything, though he told himself none of it meant anything beyond simple relief that she was safe. Yet he found himself lingering near the study doorway when she came to clean, finding small reasons to ask about her day, to learn more about the woman who had spent months moving invisibly through his home. One evening, Alina stayed later than usual, finishing a task in the study while Dmitri worked quietly at his desk nearby. Neither of them spoke for a long while, but the silence between them felt different than before, comfortable rather than tense. Eventually, Dmitri set down his pen and asked if she would like to sit for a moment, rather than rush back to an empty apartment. What began as a simple offer turned into a long conversation that stretched past midnight. Alina spoke about her hopes for the future, dreams she had buried for years beneath fear and survival. Dmitri, a man rarely known for opening up to anyone, found himself sharing pieces of his own past, memories he had not spoken aloud in a very long time. These evenings became a quiet habit between them, growing more frequent as the weeks continued. Alina began to see a side of Dmitri that few people ever witnessed, a thoughtful, patient man hidden beneath the reputation that surrounded him outside these walls. Dmitri, in turn, found himself drawn to her strength, the quiet courage it had taken her to survive everything she had endured and still choose kindness. Neither of them spoke about what was happening between them at first. It felt fragile, something neither wanted to disturb by numbing it too soon. But the signs were there in every lingering glance, every conversation that ran longer than it needed to, every small smile exchanged across the study in the evening light. Alina realized one night, sitting across from him with tea slowly cooling between them, that the man everyone in the city feared had become the person who made her feel safest in the world. Dmitri realized, in turn, that the woman he had first noticed only because of a single mark on her wrist had become someone he thought about constantly, someone whose happiness had somehow become important to his own. In time, what started as protection quietly grew into something neither of them had expected to find. Alina, who had once believed she was invisible to everyone around her, discovered that the most powerful man in the city had seen her clearly from the very beginning. And Dmitri, who had spent his life keeping everyone at a careful distance, found that the walls around his heart had finally begun to soften, one quiet evening at a time. What began with a single bruise on a quiet morning had become the start of something neither of them had ever expected, a second chance neither had believed they still deserved.